right. All right, so just going over some basic alignment tips for downward facing dog. Because the thing with downward facing dog is you're upside down, right? It's an inversion. And so a lot of people will have questions about downward facing dog. And so let's come to all fours, Lacey. And so if you start on all fours, you want to look at your hands. Downward facing dog is an inversion. Basically, it's the prep for arm balances. So anytime you have your hands on the mat, you want to think arm balance, and you want to make sure that your hands are lined up. So you have your hands pretty wide on your mat. Your fingers are spread. And there's some different things about the hand placement. So a lot of people will say the crease of your wrist then lines up with the short edge of your mat. You know what I'm saying? Like it's going the same. Now, with that being said, if you've got some wrist issues, you might, or tight shoulders, you're having a hard time straightening the arms, you might turn your fingers out. Okay? If you hyperextend in the arms, you have super flexibility, you might want to turn your hands in a little bit. So the answer is always going to be it depends. So you kind of have to play with that a little bit. You don't want your elbows hurting, and you don't want to be dumping into the wrist. So we have our hand placement there. Then tuck your toes and take your hips up and back for downward facing dog. Right. So a couple of things that I see here a lot is kind of hanging out in the shoulders, not really integrating the arm muscles. Right. So you want to push the floor away. And you're stretching the arms. You're really engaging the arms. If you press down into the base knuckle of your index finger, you're going to feel that all the way up, and you see the nice tricep definition in the arm. Now, this is, in my opinion, and that's really all that matters, is my opinion. But, but in my opinion, this is one of the best arm strengtheners, upper body strengtheners that there is. Go ahead and take a rest. Don't want to hold you there. So if your wrists do bother you, you can always kind of roll the wrist here. There's lots of wrist exercises that you can do. Yep, you can take backs of the hands together. You can flip the wrist back and find with your opposite thumb that little, there's a little bump there on the wrist, and roll the wrist then. Right, so lots of things you can do to take care of your wrist. But if you engage the arms, you shouldn't be dumping then into the wrist. So now let's talk about pelvis. So you can stay there just for a little bit so I don't hold you in there. So we want to think about the inner thighs going inward and back in our downward facing dog. So this is exaggeration. You don't want your downward facing dog to look like that. But that's the direction that we want to think about when we're in downward facing dog. So if we have tight hamstrings, it starts to look like this in the pelvis. So if that's the case, you've got to bend your knees. So if you have super tight hamstrings, well, how do I know if I have tight hamstrings? If you fold forward and you have to bend your knees to touch the floor, most likely you have tight hamstrings. You're going to need to bend your knees a little bit or a lot in downward facing dog. So go ahead and come into downward facing dog. And most of us like to have the feet about hip distance apart. That's, if you like your feet together, no worries. If you like them a little bit wider, that's okay. Especially if you have tight hamstrings, a little bit wider actually might help. So she has, what we're looking for is nice long spine, right? So she has this nice straight spine. But let's pull in a little bit in the ribs. Push the floor away, yeah. So this is the other thing that I see a lot is dumping in the shoulders and ribs poking out. Like the gymnasts, when they're done with their routine, they pop up, So, yeah, go ahead and show what that looks like. Now, for super flexible people like Lacey, that actually feels good probably because she's just kind of hanging out there. She's flexible. She can do that. But we want her to actually work really hard. Push the floor away, yes. Pull the bottom of the rib cage in, yeah. And then for the pelvis, you want the pelvis to tilt up, right? So if she had tight hamstrings, we were talking about this before. Yeah, that's good, actually. Yeah, I didn't know for sure because she has such a good pelvis tilt. I didn't know she was going to be able to do it like So this would be somebody with tight hamstrings, and I would want them to bend the knees. So if they bend the knees, then they can tilt that pelvis up like we're supposed to. Yeah. Now, if you can do that and then straighten the legs without the pelvis moving, you're good to go. Then pull those ribs in, push the floor away. Nice, relax. You can sit however you want to sit. So we can roll those wrists again, shake them out. One thing I showed in the last class that we did for the wrist is to come onto all fours and take your right hand and turn the palm up. And then you can start to try to move the fingers. And then you try to straighten that arm. Whoo, big stretch. Yeah. So that's just opposite action for your wrist, right? So if you're working on that. I think that's probably about it. Can you think of anything, questions that you see? Um, yeah, yeah, yeah. So they have to either take a wider stance, and so there's no set rule. You know, if you need to have your feet, the big guys, the big gym guys, right? If you need to have your feet mat width apart, take your feet mat width apart. That's going to make it a little bit easier to get into those hamstrings, and you bend the knees as much as you need to. You're thinking about your inner thighs, like I was showing those inner thighs going in, right? So you want to think about going in and then wide. You're trying to get wide in the SI joint sacrum area. Just the pelvic tilt, like the sticking like that. Yeah. Basically, it's like this action, right? You're not really doing that, but that's the action of it, right? So, I think that's about all I got on the down dog. So, yay! All right, thank you. Thanks, guys. Whew, I have no idea how that went, how that looked.